Hello and a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk on this Nobel Prize Celebration Day. And with us today, we have Fredrik von Malmberg, who's very kindly agreed to come and speak with us about the victims of climate policy. Fredrik is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science, Linköping University. And Fredrik, it is so kind of you to be with us. We're all super interested in what you're going to teach us today. I will turn my own video off as well so we get a really nice recording. But if we have experienced any difficulties, I will suddenly appear. So, Fredrik, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I think just a short background, since you mentioned I'm a political scientist, and now this is we'll talk about criminology. But the background is my research on climate change and particularly climate policy and democracy, and identifying and studying kind of the use of what from political science perspectives can be called nasty politics, where politicians and others systematically use hate speech, hate crime, violence to silence political opponents. And this we have seen in Sweden and elsewhere in Europe and other parts of the world. Climate activists, particularly vulnerable, but also journalists, researchers, scientists, people in public authorities, etc. One thing I found, which made me more interested into kind of the victim's perspective or victimology perspectives, is that there has been quite a lot of discussions about hate speech and hate crime towards climate activists, climate journalists, etc., as a threat to democracy. But I think there is something missing in between, because the threat to democracy just doesn't just appear. It is first of all a threat and has negative implications, negative effects and consequences of the real people that are actually threatened, hated, threatened, beaten, and so on. So I started to look more into the victims' perspectives of this hate speech and hate crime. And what struck me was that very few, if any, consider themselves to be victims. They don't use the word victim. So I looked more into this and tried to see kind of the links between kind of the use of hate speech to the climate change crime more generally. And if we can, so there is, with the green criminology, focus on climate change crime, but there are more kinds of crimes that could be added. So therefore, I'm talking about victims of climate policy or climate policy crimes. The green criminology, I will just give some background. It's kind of the study of harms against humanity, environment, non-human species, etc., related to climate change or other kinds of environmental degradation, emissions, natural resources use, etc. And it includes with the climate change, we have the merging of environmental rights and human rights into also climate justice. So it's not only about crimes against the environment or crimes non-human species, etc., but it's kind of broader and broadens green criminology. In victimology, there has for a long time been kind of a consideration of an ideal victim, that is, or a stereotype of people that are or could be ideal victims, that they are weak and vulnerable, they are not threatening anyone else, they're carrying out a respectable project in a place no one can blame them for they're abused by a bad, strong, unknown offender with no relation to the victim, etc. But this has got criticized specifically from feminist criminologists. If you consider domestic violence, where people, well, the offender and the victim knows each other, etc. But it's also been seen in international criminal law. And the research, critical criminology, feminist criminology, cultural criminology sees it now more, or rather than presenting victims as essentially powerless or passive, you now look into the characteristics of the victim-offender relationship, the victim's sense of threat and subsequent coping, society's interest and values at the time of victimization, that the term or the process of victimization is culturally dependent. And the victimization itself is related to both the severity of the injury and the level of resilience, and that is quite important. The resilience of the victim, which is related to the resources to help victims, or the form of agency of potential victims, and victims or real victims that have been kind of oppressed, and that they are not passive or powerless. Another important part, which we can see in lots of crimes, specifically domestic violence, but you can also see it in climate policy crime, is that the offender is using a kind of a deny, attack, reverse victim and offender roles, blaming the victim of being the real offender, the real criminal, and portraying that to the public in the general discourse. Interestingly, in this setting is that the International Court of Justice this summer stated that nation states have a duty to act with due diligence and use all means at their disposal to prevent activities carried out in their jurisdiction and control from causing significant harm to the climate system, and that there are legal consequences if they are not doing this. This isn't kind of a ruling in a case, but a response to the UN General Assembly. But it says something about that nation states actually have a legal responsibility, and they can. There are legal consequences if they do not meet these kind of responsibilities, which is important for climate activists, etc., in the discussions on, for instance, in Sweden, whether the government is doing enough or not enough within climate policy. And I mentioned there is also an active agency of climate change victims, not all, but with climate activists, for instance, that environmental movement, climate movements, climate justice movements are speaking kind of for the environment, for potential victims, but also for themselves. Kind of in relation to the escalating climate emergency. But this is not just climate activists. You could add climate scientists, even if some of them or most of them do their research with some kind of emotional motivation. But they're doing research to provide knowledge for climate policy. Civil servants in public authorities provide analysis and suggestions for climate policy. Climate journalists disseminate information and knowledge to the general public and others to know and to also, when it comes to climate policy, write about research, protest on kind of inappropriate climate policies. But as I mentioned, the climate justice discourse broadens the perspective on victimization and crime beyond the harms of climate change itself. The policies or measures to mitigate the climate change may have negative effect or impacts on vulnerable groups of people in local communities, regions, countries, globally, etc. So it's not only that kind of emitting greenhouse gases causes problems, but the way you could mitigate that may cause new problems. And what is needed is to to integrate cultural criminology with green criminology, to address this, to understand kind of, and I should say this is criminology is not crime in a legal sense, which you can kind of in court cases, but the study of crimes which some of them may be kind of criminal already in legal terms, but there might be issues that perhaps should be criminal or criminalized. But there are contestations of space, transgression, resistance, how a crime is constructed and represented in the media, etc. And if you should look, this is a bit messy perhaps, but I mentioned the nasty politics of which includes nasty rhetoric with hate, systematic use of hate speech, threats, violence, etc. in climate politics. That is part of a conflict over definitions of conduct, legitimacy of knowledge claims, citizen participation in public policy debates, etc. Do we have kind of the pro-climate group, which has been defined as an out-group, the others by climate kind of right-wing populist or sometimes far-right populist climate deniers, and they themselves claim to be the in-group, the we. There are, so in this picture I skip kind of the crimes related to climate change itself, or the emissions. To start by protesting and providing information that shows that the government is doing too little in accordance to the responsibilities. They respond with insults, accusations, intimidations, incitement back to those groups of people, the activists, scientists, activists, climate scientists, civil servants, journalists, etc. And they react in different ways. A lot of them react with fear, but also angst. and withdraw as kind of predicted by the in-group. Others get more angry and kind of do counterattacks, or what you call it, continue with the protests back to to the in-group. And the government counterattacks again with kind of harder and harder repression. If the insults, accusations, and so on can be called soft repression, then we have the hard repression with people being fired from public energy agencies. There have been cases discussed in media with one climate activist being caught by the police several times without any warning and placed in immigration centers and threatened to be thrown out of Sweden, despite his EU citizen. There are cases of EU citizens working in Sweden and have their applications for Swedish citizenship being rejected because of kind of what is called kind of unduly behavior or so, because they have participated in climate actions. There has been some actual violence also. And there are message effects not only directed towards the specific persons, but to society in general. We have seen reported, for instance, that due to the word activist having kind of shifted from being a positive word to being equal to more or less criminal. The management of publishers in media and in public authorities kind of get scared or fear from their organizations getting the stamp of an activist. So they kind of replace people or reorganize the organizations and let people working on climate issues kind of, or have them to end working on this. So there are different kinds of hate speech and hate crime. I won't go into this. This is also the nasty rhetoric, the different levels of it, and share the slides afterwards. I also tried to map the impacts from using the specific elements of nasty politics and rhetorics to or through the harms of victims, the social and political effects, the behaviors of the victims, how that impacts human rights in liberal democracies, people's roles in liberal democracies, in the views of liberal democracies, etc. So not just saying that hate and threat or hate speech is a threat to democracy, but actually trying to map kind of the linkages and what makes it a threat to democracy. So when it comes to democracy, there is, first of all, a pernicious polarization to dismantle pluralism, very much using emotional governance, no logic at all, no facts, mainly lie and misinformation, talking to the emotions of people. There is a discouraging of public deliberation and scrutiny of power. and there is a reduction of the civic space. These are kind of the basic real threats to democracy. And this, and then now linking what we can see to the framework of democracy threatening crimes in Sweden, there is such a framework that the police and the security services, SEPO, is working with, which includes hate crime, which is not really a crime in itself. It just renders harder sanctions. There is kind of a category of democracy crime, which mainly relates to kind of hate crime on journalists and politicians. We have the violent extremism, and we have influence crime if someone is targeting a public policy officer or a civil servant in the state government and trying to influence them to take a decision in a certain direction. There will be, or I should say, last year, the European Parliament and the Council agreed on what is called the SLAP directive, which aims at kind of criminalizing certain kinds of legal procedures towards journalists, activists, scientists, etc., but also other kinds of unduly influence on activists, scientists, journalists, who want to participate in the public discussion on climate change, on other issues. This is to be transposed into Swedish legislation next year. I've seen the proposal from the government, which is, or the proposal sent for public consultation by the government, and that is not really, according to my opinion, we've been working with transposing EU directives for kind of 18 years. Also, it does not meet the standards of the EU legislation. It could be a strong legislation, but these categories are quite narrow, specifically the democracy crime, and there would be a need to kind of change the legislation to make democracy threatening crimes really criminal. There are a lot of other ways to handle this and to kind of restrict or avoid the democracy crimes. Now, what we can see here, we have a kind of victims, sometimes the same persons or so, but victims in a system of criminal acts related to climate change. To the right hand, we have the climate change crimes, the governments kind of, and the parliaments approving inappropriate climate policies that make corporations and some people emit too much greenhouse gas emissions, which causes climate change, and then victims of climate change. Some of the victims are taking action from science, etc. Protests to governments, protests against corporations, etc. The government, as I mentioned, kind of responds to this with soft and hard repression, both directly and indirectly. And they're usually doing this within the kind of with the Darvo approach, despite the fact that, for instance, climate activists are protesting against the crimes of the government. The government is claiming that the climate activists are the real offenders and that they are the criminals. but it's actually the government that are the criminals. So we have this tries then to link we have the climate change crimes and we have hate crimes and democracy crimes. And this is what I see the crimes and the victims of climate policy. Then in the discussions about, for instance, in Sweden and the upcoming elections next year, I see that many climate activists and politicians have said next year the election has to be about climate change. But now I see kind of a shift towards another position that says next year the elections has to be about democracy. And that is kind of an issue, how to prioritize. Should it be a prioritization? Which both kinds of crimes are really bad, but how do we work with them? Is one of the crimes more important than the other one? Can we deal with climate change if we don't deal with democracy or autocratization? So at the end, climate policy criminology is about climate change crime, hate crime, democracy crime, and what it could include, what we need to study, and not only study scientifically, but also discuss in the public, since crimes and victimization are culturally dependent. Victims of climate change and victims of, or specifically victims of hate crime and democracy crime, are seldom viewing themselves as victims for different reasons. And we need to change the discourse on this if something is going to happen, and also about the threats to democracy. For further reading, I've written about this in 2 papers which are submitted, and I've got them back, and I'm now revising them and sending them back again before Christmas but they are kind of the preprints of the papers are available. So I stop there and open up for
And
any
thank you very
questions or
much.
comments.
Thank you very much for a really super and instructive seminar.